program to accept a value in floating point variable, float variable, and check whether the value stored in it is an integer value or floating point value. That is, if I take an n as a float variable where 4 bytes has been allocated, in a float variable if you give a 35, then it will be stored as an 35.0, and if I give a 35.83, then it will be stored as an 35.83. That means you can store an integral data as well as floating point data. But of course, when you give 35, it will be stored as an 35.0. But if you are not having a floating point data, then we'll display that data as an integer. But if it is having a floating point value like 0.83, we'll display the data as a float value. Now, how do we find out this in a float variable whether the data is an integer or float? So what you do is you take up here two floating point variables, float n, and one more temporary variable you take, that is t. Okay, so inside n you store, let's assume that you have stored 35, then it will be stored as in 35.0. You typecast this n value to an integer and store into an t. So when I typecast this 35.0 to an integer, it will be 35, and when you store into an t, it will be stored as it is, that is on 35.0. But the same thing, if this n value is 35.86, and if you typecast it to an integer and store it into an t, 35.86, when you typecast it to an integer, then 0.86 will get truncated and you'll have only 35. And when you store 35 into an t, then it will be a 35.0. And now you compare whether both these n and t value both are equal. When it won't be equal, when this 0.86 has been truncated, then naturally it is not going to be equal. So if it is not equal, that means it is an float value. But if it is equal, when it is equal, then it is an int value, integer value. Okay, this is the logic to find out whether the given data is an integer or float. So for doing that, you need two float variables. Float, I'll take here n and t, accept the data, enter data, and now what you do, read it by giving scanf, but you have to read it as a float value. If you read it as an integer value, you cannot store 35.86. Okay, ampersand of n. So now this n value has to be typecasted. Okay, and the basic elements we have discussed about typecasting. So now n value, you need to typecast it to an integer and store into an t. That can be done by giving here t is equals to, within bracket, the data type should be typecasted to what type, that has the data type has to be specified in a bracket. So I want this n to be converted to an integer, so I have to give her within bracket int and then give her n. So this n value now gets typecasted to an integer and stored into an t. And then after this you compare here now. If this n value is equals to t, when it is going to be equal, provided if both are, if it is an integer value. Okay, after truncating the decimal point, and if you store into t, you will get the same value. So if it is equal, then it is going to be an integer data. The given data is integer. Given data is integer. Else, if it is not equal, then it's going to be a float value. Then you can display a printf. Given data is floating point, and then close this. Fine. So we'll check out the output in a code block. Fine. Program to check given data is integral data or floating point data. So here enter the data. So we have accepted an floating point value. The data has been accepted in float variable, and then here the typecasting has been done. This float value has been typecasted in integer and then stored into again back into float value. By doing this, the fractional part will get truncated, and then check here whether n value is it equals to t. If it is equal, then given data %f is an integral data, else given data is an floating point data. We'll run the code. So I'll give here 35.8 and press enter key. So it displays given data as 35 point. So it will be stored in a fractional part in this way, is an floating point data. Okay, it's a floating, it shows as in floating point data. But the same thing, if I give here the data as in 35 and press enter key, it displays here 35 is an integral